Hello everyone, it's Mike BATT here again, and I'm here in my little writing room, my bat cave, and this is episode 2 of my little chatty things. I feel a bit embarrassed calling it an episode because it's not really well, it's episodic I suppose because they're one after the other, but they're not like a show really. It's not like, welcome to the show, here comes this person, that person. It's just me just wandering around with various thoughts. And I thought actually, literally, I've got to tell you, when I pressed the go button on my phone, which I'm recording this on, I had no idea whether I was going to talk to you about continuing a bit more about orchestration, or about, somebody asked me to do one about lyrics. So I might even do a bit of both. I might chuck in all sorts of different ideas from different, areas of the whole subject of making records, songwriting, everything. Excuse me, I'm going to just undampen my top lip. For some reason that started to glow a bit. And this is what I call an undampener. It's tissue. Marvellous things. Anyway, so... Right, okay, where are we going with this? We're going to start... I think I will talk a bit more about the orchestra side of life, because something somebody said on one of the comments triggered from last time, triggered me to think, and I remembered back. The subject was whether an orchestra can feel as well as a rock and roll musician, say. And there's a sort of rivalry, or there used to be, certainly when I started, literally 50 years ago, 54 years ago actually. Orchestral musicians tended to think that rock and roll musicians were a different breed. Well, they are, I guess, but everyone chose music for their career. So that's why we're all, brothers and sisters, as it were, in the same subject. We're trying to express ourselves through music. So a rock and roll musician and a symphonic musician, they all chose music as their career. So doesn't entitle a rock and roll musician to say, oh, those string players, they can't feel it properly. There's a famous, I promise you I wouldn't tell any funny stories, but there's a famous comment made by Clem Catini, the drummer, brilliant rock and roll drummer. He's been on not every record I made, but certainly most of the records I made up until 20 years ago, when he sort of cut back on his workload. Clem, the engineer, was asking, there's a whole orchestra in the studio, and the engineer was asking, is everybody's headphone balance okay? And Clem shouted out, because he always used to shout funny remarks, yeah, but can I just hear the strings just a bit earlier in my cans? And of course that got a great laugh. The joke being, of course, that the strings sometimes play a bit late. Well, very often that could be because of the acoustic properties of the room. They don't hear the rhythm until it travels across to them. Or you might say, well, yeah, but they've got headphones on. They haven't all. Sometimes they have one headphone and the other one, so they can, in fact, it's very common for string players just to have one headphone so they can hear what's going on in the room. But the joke about the string player not having the feel, not feeling the groove, is a common one, and it's a misconception. I reckon there used to be much more of it than there is now. The snobbishness where a symphonic player would look down on a rock and roll player, because the rock and roll players usually learnt the 3-chord trick, then added another chord, and gradually learnt to do bar chords, and then maybe became a genius. Maybe started doing shreddy guitar solos that a violinist sitting in an orchestra could only dream of or do when it's written down. And yes, there are different kinds of musicians there are some musicians I know in the highest level of symphonic playing who wouldn't be able to play jazz over chords. And I know other people, like I'd worked with Stefan Grappelli, and he could read music, but he'd much rather riff over some chords, and he was absolutely, totally brilliant. I had the honour of sitting down and playing with him after we'd worked together on my musical, actually it's a record album at the time, called The Hunting of the Snark, available at all good record shops still. And Stefan said, oh, I want to play the tune, the written tune. And I said, well, yeah, but I really would like you to play jazz, and that's what you do a great thing. So he did the jazzy thing I wanted, and he did it so beautifully. It was fantastic. So fantastic that you should all rush out and buy The Hunting of the Snark, or let's just have a listen on Spotify. It's in a track called Midnight Smoke, sung by Julian Lennon, and in a few other places, like there's a thing called The Escapade on that album. You can find his work. I mean, most people know Stefan Grappelli as the brilliant jazz fiddle player he was, but he I don't think Stefan would have been comfortable sitting in a string section cutting it along with all the symphonic musicians who only ever played mostly only ever played from music, because he wasn't comfortable doing that. And we are all different. And so anyway, here we go with a chat that I had with Eric Clapton about 3 years ago. I was recording Hawkwind and producing an album by Hawkwind, and Eric agreed to do a guitar solo on it. And so he came over to the studio and we recorded it. Actually, it was before we recorded his solo, actually. We were having lunch. It was one of those, rock and roll musicians tend to get up late and turn up late to the studio. So he turned up just in time for lunch, which was lovely. We were sitting there eating sushi and Hawkwind all around. And I'm going to undampen for some reason, needed to do that today. Anyway, so Eric said to me that he'd had a bad experience the week before or a couple of weeks earlier. This was before COVID, where he'd had a string section in and they hadn't felt the music as well as a rock and roll player would. And I said, well, yeah, okay. And I gave him my theory on it, which is that really it's never their, well, these days it's rarely the player's fault. It is if it's the end of a day and they're tired and they can't be bothered, and that happens in every walk of life. It's not just orchestras. It's not just, what happens when the rock and roll musicians get fed up? It's their album, they just knock off, or they go and have a fag, or a pint. Same as everyone. But when you're actually doing the proper sessions, the concentration level of a fine musician, somebody good enough to be booked in a top orchestra, it's immaculate. And if you've got someone who knows what they're doing, running the session, then you should get a good result. So I was saying to Eric, so what was the problem, for example? He said, well, I would say to them, I want you to push that beat. And I'd say, well, okay, and how many musicians were you talking to? He said, well, 30 string players. Okay, so somebody's written a score. Oh, by the way, I'm not knocking whoever it was that did the score. I'm just saying that Eric's expectations of that person and of the orchestra, beyond the arranger and beyond the conductor, whoever it was, were probably a bit too much. In other words, you can't talk to an orchestra and say, can you feel it differently? Can you make it more energetic? You can say, can you play very fractionally ahead of the beat? But a conductor would have to say that, and he'd have to probably beat it a fraction ahead. And he'd probably have to ask them to lean forward and push it a little bit. And you can say that if you're talking to an intelligent bunch of people, which all usually are. They're all intelligent, aren't they? Because otherwise they wouldn't be doing sessions. But if you say, look, can you lean back on the beat a bit? And it's a bit hard. It's easy enough to say that to a drummer, and usually you find that's inherent in their style anyway. But and have you noticed how some drummers sit back on the beat? And like Henry Spinetti, who, funny enough, worked a lot for Eric. He's one of Eric's favourite drummers, and he's worked a lot with me as well. He's done all the KT Melua stuff and other stuff we did when we were younger. And he naturally, a bit like Ringo, sits back right on the beat, but just maybe a touch behind, but you wouldn't pick it. It's just a feel. And same with drummers who you might say, I want this to drive along and I want you to almost lead it. But it's a dangerous instruction, that, because you can end up with it sort of tripping over itself and everyone goes in funny directions. But I'm just saying, drummers have their own style. You can't say that to an orchestra because you've got 50 people in the room. You can't say, I want it this way or that way. You can if you're the conductor and you've got a really good bond with them. You can say to the horn section, can you not play it quite as literally on the beat? Can you just play it a bit lazy? And they'll go, okay, and they'll try it. And if, as they always are good enough, they will play it like that. But you have to make a specific instruction. I keep talking about the horn section. Last time I spoke about the horn section. But that is a particular example that you could say to anybody. So fact is, I'm talking to Eric about whether you can get an orchestral musician to feel. And he's saying, how do you tell a musician to push the beat? Well, there is only one way, really, and that's to write it pushed. And by pushed, I mean what Eric meant was you go 1, 2, 3, 4. Normally if it was just straight on the beat, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, bam, 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 whatever. But he wants 1, 2, 3, 4, bam, 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 which is pushing. That's what you would say in a rock and roll band. You're talking together, right? Let's push that second line of the chorus. So whatever it was, they're both pushed because they're technically what's happening is it's a quaver earlier, an eighth beat earlier than the beat. And the only way you can tell an orchestra to do that is to write it a quarter note earlier, an eighth note earlier, a quaver earlier than the beat. And then I guarantee you they'll all go and these days they've got a click in their headphones and you're conducting them. So there's every chance that these top musicians are going to get it smack on and they'll get that accent exactly right. But if then just after that, if it's you've got to go after the first note, you've got to go through and articulate with a little sort of arrow at the top. It's an accent sign. Everyone knows what I'm talking about, and those who don't know what I'm talking about obviously don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, it's like a little chevron above the note, and that means you accent it. So da 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 da. So that's 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2, but it's on 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2, and it's still on 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2. But when I've gone 1 2 3 1 2 3, that's where you have to put the accents, and then the symphonic musician, I'd say the symphonic musician, the string player, the violinist or whatever, the cellist is going to go daddle daddle do, just because it's written that way. You can't say you can't write da 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 dee dee da ding and expect a player to know that you want it accented. You have to write the accents in. Of course, what you can do is write it without the accents, get to the studio and then tell them where you want the accents. But that's going to take up a good 15 minutes of studio time, and it costs thousands of pounds a minute, certainly thousands of pounds every 15 minutes. And you're just wasting time. So the trick is to articulate it. And I spend half the time, once I've finished a score, not once I've finished it, I do it while I'm going along. You have to instruct the orchestra as if this 50-person or 100-person orchestra is one person, because it's no good. What's the word? There's no good expecting them all to feel it just because you're going to stand in front of it and say, look, I'm a rock and roll musician and I want you to feel it. You can sing it to them, sure enough, but they're not all going to exactly remember it. It's much, much better if you can written down. And here's the point, the big point. You can articulate it in a written way, in exactly the way you want it to be performed. Every nuance of the way you want it played can be articulated in writing. And that's what I meant in the first thing about being able to learn how to write music down. Of course, it can be done on a DAW, on a DAW writing machine. Absolutely can. But make sure you do it, because the problem I was talking about with Eric just won't occur if you don't expect anything from that. Put it this way, you're talking to very articulate, very highly accomplished musicians, but there's 50 of them. You cannot expect a crowd of, effectively it is, a crowd of people all to behave exactly the same at any millisecond of the piece, unless it's all written down so that everyone's got the accents written in exactly the same place. And if you want it a diminuendo so that they hit it, let's say there's a long note at the end of the second accent, da 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 da. Let's say you want a fall on a big brass like a James Bond thing, da 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 da. Well, there's a special thing you write for it. It's an obvious sign. It's a sort of fall. It's called a fall, and you just write a kind of downwards curve, and it shows the trumpet player. I say trumpet player because I'm thinking Bond now. Da 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 da. And how long that note is? It's a dotted minim, but does it finish on 1, 2, 3, 4? Does it finish on the 4, or does it finish on the 3? Da 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 3. Or da 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 off on 4. If you articulate that would have to be a dotted minim with a slur tied to a quaver which falls on the 4th beat, and then a quaver rest. Everybody in the orchestra then knows that you come off on 4, and they don't have to put their hand up and say, "Excuse me, do you want it to come off on 3, or do you not come off on 4?" The usual answer would be off on 4 on a situation like that, but you have to write it in, and if you don't, you will waste a lot of time in the studio. So anyway, I seem like I'm telling you off for not doing it, and you haven't done it yet. Anyway, so or maybe some of you have. Anyway, what else was it? But yeah, a couple of little things about orchestration. Again, mutes. Certainly, and I remember having this happen when I was very young, and I was getting jobs where the client, or me, it might have been a record, usually was actually me making the record. I'm undampening myself again. Usually, if you only had a very small budget, but the client, it's a pop record, and you're trying to get strings on it, and they wanted basically a big, like a violin line. Well, just hire violins. I would usually my habit would be to have hired 1 cello, but 5 violins. 5 violins just being an amount that's slightly more than 4 and slightly less than 6. I say more than 4 because it's a section. It's not, 4 is 2 desks, and 1 extra just seems that bit better. And I would often hire a flute to go with that, so that you get that lovely thing that Elgar used to do beautifully. And you'll find if you read orchestration books that a lot of symphonic composers do, which is to double the violins with the flute, because the flute has got a lovely way of being I nearly said invisible, but it's definitely not inaudible, but it's got such a lovely soft tone in the right register that, and maybe if you put some reverb on it and keep it behind the violins, it softens and broadens the violin sound so that your crummy little 5 violin section sounds enormous, because it's playing unison. It's got the same notes to play exactly, or you can do it with it an octave up, but I think if you want that broad sound that sounds, it's quite an English sound, although everybody did it from, you know, Sibelius did it. Yeah, I could name any, Beethoven did it, you know, I mean, it's not an English thing, it's just, it's very prevalent in the writing of Elgar and Delius, and, you know, it's just a lovely way of making strings sound bigger and softer. And here's where the softer comes in, is another way to make a small violin section or string section sound bigger is mutes. And for those who don't know, mutes are a little peg, like a clip. Some people have actually used a paper clip because they forgot their mute, left it at home. And it works pretty much just as well, not quite as well. And it softens, what it does is it stops the sound from resonating round the instrument quite as brightly. And it gives you this lovely, almost like you're hearing it through a sock. I know engineers who claim they can imitate the sound of mutes by rolling off all the top frequencies. And maybe you could, but it doesn't sound the same. And anyway, the person playing it should be hearing it with the mute. The effect is almost a translucent, foggy effect that, whether it's just 5 violins and a flute on a pop record, to give you that lovely big sound behind just a rhythm section, effectively, or part of a massive composition for the full orchestra. Those two things I sort of mentioned almost in one breath, i.e. the flute doubling, but also the fact that the orchestra, in certain circumstances, being muted, is just a beautiful sound. And it's somehow broader and softer and like a velvety version of the slightly brighter, vibrant sound of the unmuted sound. So have a look at mutes. I mean, you know, I don't know whether I'm talking to people that know much about arranging or people that don't know anything, and maybe it's interesting to both, or maybe it's boring to both. But I do feel that I use mutes quite a lot. You need to leave a couple of bars free for the mute to come off or on. So you put con sordine, which means with mute, or consord. The quick version is to write con which means with, and sord, which means with mute. So you want the mute, and then you put your dynamics on and stuff like that, crescendos, diminuendos, whatever. And then when you want the mute to come off, you put the word senza, which means without. So you don't even put senza sordine anymore. You just write senza, because everyone knows it has to be without mute. What else would it be without? Without feeling? Without consideration? Of course not. It's without mute. SENZA. And you write that, but you've got to give a couple of bars to take it off. And you have to be careful in your recording, because when they all take it off, it goes clink, clack, or whatever, something like that. And it goes on, you're recording it. Well, if that's in an empty section of 8 bars where the strings aren't playing, that's fine, because you can just bring the faders down later. You just record the click, clack of them taking their mutes off. But if it's in an important moment where they're doing something important very, very soon after that, you probably don't want the reverberation of that click of the mute coming off and going back to rest on the body of the instrument. So that's one way of doing it. Another way, which I like less, is to write mutes off one by one, or mutes on one by one, which means that if let's say you've got 8 bars before you want, or let's say you've got 16 bars before you want the mutes to be off. You've had a nice soft section and you want the mutes to come off so you can do a real blaring big crescendo, and you want the unmuted strings for that. If you write senza sordine, one by one, you write the words one by one, what that means is that desk by desk or player by player, and they know how to do it, they just take them off bit by bit. The leader would go first, then the person sitting next to the leader, then it goes back through the desks. And in 16 bars time, they've all taken their mutes off and they're ready for the great big smash. And that works fine, but it does mean you're losing a player. Well, you're not losing a player, but you're running the risk of hearing the mutes coming off. On a record, it doesn't matter in concert, that you're far enough away from the audience not to really hear it. But on a record, you can hear every little tiny thing. So mutes off one by one isn't great. And also on a record, you don't need it, because what you do is you write up until the chorus, then you stop recording. Everyone takes their mutes off, you go back a couple of bars, you play again, and then you drop in right on the chorus, and they've got their mutes off. So recording is a whole different thing from concert. But every tiny little thing, like taking a mute off or turning a music page, if you're turning a music page during a recording, particularly I've done it as the conductor. I've had Hayden Bendel, is a wonderful friend of mine he's got an engineering credit list as long as, I'd be here all day if I told you his credits. He's worked in classical, he's worked a lot. He's worked with Kate Bush, he's done so many wonderful things. I'd be conducting away as a sort of, I'm a kind of producer conductor. I run in, listen to it, run out again, do another take, that sort of thing. And I've not often, but sometimes I've had Hayden, or whoever it might be engineering, say, Mike, that was a good take, but we could hear you turning the pages of the score. And sure enough, there's a microphone just above me, which is the most important microphone in the whole room, because it's getting the whole orchestra. There are microphones all at each desk, or each 4 players, whatever it is we choose. But the one that's the most important is the one that's right in the middle. It's either a tree, as we call it, of 3 microphones, or it's a stereo pair. And of course, it's also the nearest to my score. So if I'm turning over the score and it makes a noise, that is a no-no. You can't use the take. You have to take another one. Anyway, so there we are. There's a little bit about string recording. It's not enough ever. And I know that we're going up to 28 minutes. And I may not post this because there was a couple of stupid bits earlier where I sounded stupid. I don't like to put the show in editor, but you never know. I could put it onto my Mac and just chop out the stupid bit. Anyway, you'll know by the time you get to this part of me here doing this, whether I've cut the stupid bit out or not. I probably won't have done, actually. I'm trusting you to still think it was okay, even though I had a stupid bit in it. So anyway, I don't know what did I speak about? Did I do any lyrics? No, I didn't talk about lyrics at all. Anyway, let's hope that was of some interest. And if it was of no interest, I'm sorry. And I won't do it again. Well, probably will, actually. But it'll be too late because you'll have had to listen to 30 minutes of it before you realised how boring it was. And it's now 29:30. So I've got 30 seconds left to say goodbye. So this is me, Mike Batt, saying, please press the, subscribe thingy, and thank you and good night. Episode 2, that's a wrap.